They thought captivity meant death, chains, whips, hunger. But when the gates opened, the guards smiled, and in their hands, bottles of Coca-Cola glistening in the sun. August 1945, Japan had fallen. But for these men, what came next wasn't punishment. It was confusion, because the enemy they'd been taught to hate treated them like human beings. This is the story Japan buried, and America never told. How kindness broke the last weapon of war, fear. If this story makes you question what war really means, then stay, because what happens next will change the way you see both sides of history. August 1945. The Empire of Japan had fallen. What followed was chaos. Cities in ruins, orders of surrender echoing through broken radios, soldiers, nurses, and clerks, all rounded up by Allied forces. Most had been told capture meant death. Some tried to end their lives before the enemy could. But thousands too weak to fight laid down their arms. They expected torture camps, darkness, hunger, humiliation. Instead, when the ships docked, in America they saw clean barracks, hot meals, and guards who spoke without hatred. For the first time they began to wonder, had everything they'd been told been a lie? When the ships finally reached American shores, silence filled the decks. The prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in worn uniforms that still carried the smell of smoke and salt. They didn't know where they were. All they knew was one thing. This was the enemy's land. From the harbor, they were loaded onto long, rattling trains. The journey was endless. Miles of farmland, open skies, and the hum of freedom outside the windows. But inside the carriages, fear clung to the air like fog. No one spoke. Every sound, every shout from an American guard, made hearts stop. When the trains finally slowed, the men pressed against the windows. The sign outside read, Camp Hearn, Texas. Others went to California, Kansas, and the Midwest, scattered across a country they'd only known through propaganda posters showing monsters and demons wearing American uniforms. And yet, when the doors opened, there were no monsters. Just young American guards barely older than them, holding rifles, but not aiming them. The prisoners stepped off the train, heads bowed. The locals stood nearby, staring in disbelief. They'd expected wild, savage soldiers, but what they saw were quiet, polite men who bowed slightly and whispered, "Sumimasen," excuse me. Even the guards looked uncertain, unsure how to treat an enemy who greeted them with respect. That first night, the camp was silent. No one dared to speak above a whisper. The Japanese men sat on their bunks, clutching their bags, or what little they had left. The lights dimmed. Outside, the sound of crickets mixed with the distant whistle of a passing train. Inside, stomachs growled. Then one soldier noticed something on his bunk, a small plate with a slice of bread and a pat of butter. He froze. His breath caught. Was this a test? Poison? He looked at the door. No guards watching. No laughter. Just silence. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, hunger broke him. He tore a piece, sniffed it, and ate. He watched the bread for hours, waiting for poison. Then hunger won. He ate, and nothing happened. For the first time, he slept. When morning came, the men were still alive. No torture, no shouting, no whips, just the smell of breakfast, and American guards telling them calmly, "Get in line, food's ready." Some couldn't move. Some cried quietly, because at that moment they realized something their empire never prepared them for, that mercy could hurt more than cruelty. That day, the first wall of fear began to crack, and for the first time since the war began, they started to question who the real enemy had been all along. The morning after their first quiet night in America, the Japanese prisoners woke to the smell of something unfamiliar. Breakfast. Not the scraps they'd imagined, not the thin gruel of wartime rations, but real food, eggs, bread, hot coffee. They moved in lines, eyes down, hands trembling. Every movement was slow, cautious, as if one wrong step would trigger the cruelty they had been warned about. But the guards didn't yell. They didn't strike. They handed out trays with a nod and a quiet, "Good morning." The prisoners didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. It wasn't hate. It wasn't anger. It was normal. That was the first crack in the wall of fear. Later that day, an American guard, maybe 19, maybe 20, approached a small group of prisoners. He smiled awkwardly and held out a pack of cigarettes. The men froze. Was this another test? He shrugged, took one himself, lit it, and said, "Here, smoke." One of the prisoners, a former Navy mechanic, slowly reached out. His hand shook as he took the cigarette. The guard lit it for him. The man inhaled, coughed, then smiled. It was the first smile seen in that camp. Word spread quietly. "The guards, they gave us cigarettes." Someone whispered back, "They don't even hit us?" Another said, "Maybe they will. Later." But later never came. Over the following weeks, something strange began to happen. The Americans talked, not like victors, not like masters, but like people. They asked questions. "Where are you from? Do you have family?" Sometimes the prisoners didn't understand the words, but they could read the faces. And those faces didn't carry hate. One day, a Japanese doctor among the prisoners noticed an American soldier struggling to bandage a wound. Without thinking, he stepped forward and gestured, "I can help." The guard hesitated, then nodded. That moment changed everything. Soon, the doctor was working side by side with American medics in the camp infirmary, treating his own men, and sometimes even the guards. The sight of it stunned everyone. An American and a Japanese soldier, enemies just weeks ago, now bending over the same patient, speaking in broken English and gestures, saving a life together. At night, the doctor would sit alone on his bunk, staring at his hands, the same hands that once served an empire built on hate. He whispered to himself, "This isn't a prison, it's something else." And he was right. Day by day, the barbed wire around them began to feel less like a cage and more like a strange kind of refuge. The guards started waving instead of watching. Laughter began to echo across the yard, softly, hesitantly, like a language no one had spoken in years. The word enemy started to lose its meaning, because inside those fences, something powerful was happening, the rebirth of humanity. By the second month, the camp began to find its rhythm. The chaos of arrival faded, replaced by a quiet order, a strange kind of peace. Each morning a whistle blew. The gates opened, not for punishment, but for work. Japanese prisoners were assigned to gardens, workshops, and farms. Some built fences. Others repaired tools. The same hands that once carried rifles now tended to seedlings, painted fences, and hammered nails into lumber. There was discipline, strict schedules, inspections, roll calls. But it wasn't cruelty. It was structure. And structure, after years of war and chaos, felt almost merciful. The work gave them something they hadn't felt since before the war: purpose. For the first time, they were building something, instead of destroying it. In the gardens, rows of green stretched under the American sun. Tomatoes, beans, corn, crops they planted themselves. The guards taught them to water carefully, to prune, to harvest. When the vegetables ripened, the men would line up proudly, bowls in hand, eating the food they had grown. And the irony was undeniable. Somewhere beyond those fences, ordinary American families were rationing, struggling to find sugar, meat, or butter. But inside the camps, The prisoners of war were eating full meals, balanced, warm, almost abundant. Many couldn't understand it. One soldier whispered, "Why feed us like this? We lost." Another replied softly, "Maybe. That's why." Every week the prisoners were given paper envelopes and pencils and permission to write letters home. It was the moment that broke many of them. For months, they'd been ghosts, cut off, assumed dead. Now they could write, "I am alive. I am safe." Some men wept as they wrote. Tears soaked the paper. Others stared at the blank page for hours, unsure what to say, how to explain that their captors had shown more kindness than their commanders ever had. The camp officers didn't just tolerate it, they encouraged it. "Write to your families," one American sergeant said. "Tell them the war's over, it's time to heal." And slowly, healing began. In the evenings, music drifted from the barracks. Someone had found a harmonica. Someone else carved a small chessboard out of scrap wood. The laughter returned, cautious but real. Even the guards began to change. They stopped seeing soldiers in uniform. They saw men, thin, homesick, human. They were prisoners, but they were being rebuilt. Not through power, not through punishment, but through something far more dangerous to hate: kindness. It was the summer of 1946, a year after Japan's surrender. By then, the camps had become quiet places of routine. The men worked, ate, wrote letters. They had grown used to order, even peace, but they still didn't understand why their captors were kind. Then came the day that no one forgot. It started with the sound of a truck, rumbling across the dusty yard under the bright Texas sun. The prisoners paused their work, tools in hand, watching as it rolled to a stop near the gate. The back opened with a clang, and inside were rows of glass bottles catching the sunlight like jewels. Coca-Cola. The delivery was meant for the American guards, an ordinary shipment, nothing special. But to the prisoners watching behind the wire, it looked like treasure. They had never seen anything like it. Cold bottles, fizzing with bubbles wrapped in ice. One of the guards, a young corporal, looked over the crowd of tired, curious faces. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Give them some too." The other soldiers glanced at each other, a shrug, a nod, and then, the unthinkable, the guards started handing bottles through the fence. The prisoners didn't move at first. Some thought it was a trick. Others whispered warnings. "Don't touch it. Maybe it's medicine. Maybe it's poison." One man, a former teacher from Osaka, held a bottle up to the sun. The glass gleamed. The liquid shimmered like caramel fire. He turned to a guard and asked haltingly, "Is this, American medicine?" The guard laughed, shook his head, and made a drinking gesture. So the man lifted the bottle, slowly, carefully, and took his first sip. For a second he froze. Then his eyes widened. The sweetness hit him like shock, cold, sharp, alive. He gasped, and then laughed. The others followed. Within minutes, the camp was filled with a sound no one had heard in months on laughter, real, helpless human laughter. Men who had seen cities burn now sat in the dust, drinking Coca-Cola like children tasting summer for the first time. One prisoner grinned and said in broken English, "This is how the enemy lives?" Another clinked, his bottle against his friend's, and whispered, "No, this is how humans live." The guards smiled, watching the transformation unfold. A battlefield replaced by a picnic. No orders, no ranks. Just men, sharing something simple and sweet. That moment, the Empire's lies melted faster than the ice in their bottles. The war had ended long ago on paper, but that day, under the Texas sun, it ended inside their hearts. Winter came early that year. By December, snow dusted the roofs of the barracks, softening the barbed wire and the harsh outlines of the guard towers. The camp, once a symbol of fear, now looked almost peaceful. The men worked slower, quieter. Many of them had never seen snow before. One morning, The prisoners noticed something strange in the yard. A few American guards stood together, hammering nails into a wooden stand. They carried out a small pine tree, crooked, green, and trembling in the wind. The prisoners watched from a distance as the guards began to hang small bits of colored paper and tin foil. No one knew what it meant. By nightfall, the pine tree glowed faintly under a string of flickering bulbs. Snowflakes drifted down like ashes from a gentler world. Inside the mess hall, laughter echoed, unfamiliar, soft, and warm. Then, to everyone's surprise, the prisoners were called in. The guards waved them over. "Come on," one said. "Join us." The men hesitated at the door, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Inside, the long wooden tables were covered with food, bread, soup, even meat. And on the far end of the hall, a group of soldiers singing. Their voices carried through the cold air, low, deep, full of something the prisoners didn't recognize. It wasn't command. It wasn't threat. It was joy. The Japanese men shuffled in, bowing awkwardly, unsure where to stand. But the guards smiled and gestured toward the tables. "Eat," one said simply. Slowly they sat. And then they ate. The warmth of the food, the laughter of their captors, the smell of pine and candle wax. It all felt unreal. For months they had lived in silence, expecting pain. Now they were surrounded by song. Halfway through the evening, one of the guards, a tall man with tired eyes, walked over to a prisoner who looked especially lost. In his hand he held a small, clumsily wrapped package. He placed it gently on the table. Inside was a single chocolate bar. The prisoner stared at it, speechless. He stood, bowed deeply, and whispered in broken English, "We were told you had no hearts." The guard smiled. Guess they were wrong. For a long moment neither man spoke. Then the prisoner broke the chocolate in half and offered a piece back. The guard hesitated, then accepted. That night they laughed together. Real laughter, shared between people who had once sworn to kill each other. No speeches, no politics, just the sound of voices, music, and snow tapping softly against the windows. It wasn't a treaty that ended the war for them. It was a song, a meal, and a smile. And for the first time since the war began, everyone, on both sides of the wire, felt free. By the spring of 1947, the war felt like a dream fading into memory. But for the men behind the wire, it had changed everything. One morning, orders came down the line. The war prisoners were going home. There was no cheering, just silence, heavy, uncertain. For months they had lived under the flag of their enemy and found something they hadn't expected: respect. Now they were being sent back to the empire that had fallen, to families they hadn't seen in years, to cities they no longer recognized. As they boarded the ships, American guards stood at attention. Some shook hands, some saluted, and a few, the ones who had shared cigarettes, work shifts, or a Christmas meal, simply whispered, "Good luck, friend." The journey back to Japan was quiet. When they reached their homeland, the silence turned to disbelief. What had once been cities were now fields of ash. Homes gone. Factories twisted like skeletons. Children barefoot in the ruins. The proud empire they had fought for was dust. And yet, in the midst of that devastation, these former prisoners carried something fragile, a story, one that no one wanted to hear. They tried to tell it anyway. They spoke of the Americans, of the guards who shared food, who taught them to farm, who treated them like men, not monsters. They told of a Christmas tree, of laughter, of Coca-Cola, bottles glinting in the Texas sun. They said, our enemies were kind, but kindness in a country still bleeding sounded like betrayal. Many were shunned. Some were accused of dishonor. Others stayed silent, hiding their memories like contraband hope. And yet, their words didn't vanish. They whispered them to their children. They wrote them in diaries. They carried them into classrooms, offices, and government halls. Those small stories, of mercy and captivity, became invisible seeds. Over the years, those seeds grew into something larger than anyone expected. A new Japan, one that chose peace over conquest, creation over destruction, democracy over fear. The kindness of their captors became the foundation of their country's rebirth. The war that began with bombs ended, quietly, with compassion. No flag raised, no treaty signed in this part of the story. Just a few men who discovered that even in defeat, humanity can survive. And if you listen closely, you can still hear their lesson whispering through time, that the greatest victory is not in conquering nations, but in conquering hate. Years later, one of those men visited America again. He walked into a diner, ordered a hamburger and a Coke. He stared at the bottle for a long time and smiled. History remembers wars through battles, but sometimes the real victories happen at the dinner table. If this story made you feel something, don't scroll away. Because kindness like this, even in war, deserves to be remembered. Subscribe for more forgotten stories, where humanity defeated hate